Before I get really started and deep into it, please just a big thank you to all the Forward CloudSec organizers. They've done a fantastic job. Thank you for including me in the conference today, and also good luck to all the speakers throughout the day. Hope everyone enjoys. So this talk is the presentation I wished I had seen about 3 years ago while going into a multi-account kind of strategy world. And that's, I mostly plan to cover AWS here, few mentions of GCP and Azure. But in the absence of having this talk available to me, I had to learn all of these things the hard way, doing it myself, making mistakes, and just finding out what works and what doesn't work. So I know that there's a huge amount of space in this topic, and I don't want to set the expectations low just so I can greatly exceed them, because this talk is not going to cover everything. There is a lot to cover within this topic, and that's just the way it is. I've only got 40 minutes. No matter what, though, I can promise you that you're going to make your own mistakes. You're going to screw things up, and please share your stories back to the community. That's the only way we can all learn. Now let's talk about why you might actually be pleasantly surprised by what this talk happens to be. This is going to hopefully instill upon you an appreciation for the high art form that is multi-account. It is not a science. That's one of the things that I had discovered, was that it's really more art than science into how you do this. There's going to be some advice that you can take with you and start using right away. And also hopefully some anecdotes that you really enjoy. There's going to be a lot of coverage about like what you do with how you make an organizational argument. How do you tell someone, hey, we should go multi-account? And more importantly, the arguments that will actually work for you. We'll talk about root accounts, user access, what things you should do first, a whole bunch of it. Hopefully you enjoy. Quick thing about me, my name is Brandon Sherman. I'm currently the manager of cloud security at Twilio. And you can see in the picture here in the before days, I had a haircut, but well, we all know what's going on with that lately. Also in the before times, I was a Krav Maga instructor, taking a very direct and physical approach to security. I am a 2-pizza team all on my own for certain values of pizza. And I'm also an AWS solutions architect, professional grade, which really just means I get plenty of LinkedIn spam. So, surprise, you might already be multi-account. In fact, you might already be multi-cloud. Job done, right? You don't have to see the rest of the talk. Go tell your boss, go tell your execs, you've cracked the secret. Because the secret is, all you have to do is ignore your users and they'll do it for you. Know what you've got. You could reach out to all these different vendors and you could ask them, hey, can I get a report of accounts that have been opened with my company's email domain? And they're going to escalate you because tier 1 support's not the right place to do it. And then you're going to have to get ownership of your domain, prove that you're not phishing them, get the report back in whatever form it takes, which is PDF, CSV, email, collection of phone calls, whatever it is. Get sales spam because, hey, if you upgrade to our enterprise plan now, we'll make this problem go away. Reach out to your users and finally say, hey, users, you got to either close these accounts or bring them into security compliance. By the way, if you're wondering, don't worry if you have Shadow Oracle Cloud, because their lawyers will reach out to you. But lesson 1 here is really finance is your friend. See, you could just ask them to audit for a list of expensing of cloud accounts, and they know what they're paying for. They can tell you exactly who has approved what. Now you can go reach out to those users and give them a couple of options. 1, hey, bring these accounts into compliance, or 2, we're not going to allow you to expense them anymore. And if you're not allowing people to expense other cloud resources, then now, not company paid for, not a company asset, these users are going to be moving data from a corporate-owned location to a non-corporate-owned location, and that is almost certainly an HR policy violation. It's data exfiltration. So when faced with a conversation with HR or bringing your account into security compliance, users are a lot more interested in helping get their accounts into compliance. And some of you at home on the stream are probably thinking, oh, but my users, they're good and wonderful people, and they would never do such a nefarious thing. And that just means you've never interacted with a sufficiently motivated team, because everywhere people were going to solve and do their jobs, even if that means maybe bending the rules a little tiny bit. Shadow cloud infrastructure exists. If you don't have it, you either aren't looking hard enough or you've already found it. And if you've already found it, just keep looking, because like a weed, it will keep growing back. Lesson number 2 is why you should go multi-account. Each AWS account is a hard wall that is completely separated off from other accounts. Permissions in one account don't reach into another account. This forms the concept of a blast radius, how far those permissions can reach. IAM is complicated. I have screwed it up and I have fixed it. Amazon has screwed it up, and when they were alerted, they quickly fixed it. And I can promise that either you have screwed it up or you will screw it up, and hopefully you'll fix it in time. It's not an if, but a when. And you don't want that IAM mix-up to take out an entire account. Let's give a primer about IAM. If you come from a different cloud environment, it stands for Identity and Access Management. Everyone's got something similar. In AWS, there's 2 sort of overarching primitives, principles and policies. And the principles are nouns. This is a user, a group, a role, some kind of thing. It can also be an S3 bucket, SQSQ, Lambda function. There's some different kinds of nouns, some resources that you can attach a policy directly to. And then you have the policy, which is the verbs. This is what a principle is allowed to do, or if you've got deny statements, what it's not allowed to do. If the policy is directly attached to the principle, then it's what actions other principles can take. So I can take a policy, give it to a user, say you are allowed to touch this S3 bucket in your account. Or I could take a policy and I can give it to an S3 bucket and say any principle that meets this criteria, certain account or just the world, don't do that one, is able to take certain actions on the bucket. But the important thing to understand here is permission grants are per principal and per account. So if I have 2 different users and they're in 2 different accounts, they can get 2 different sets of permissions granted to them. This is really important because in AWS, an IAM user will belong to a single AWS account. Whereas in something like GCP, users can span multiple projects. In AWS also, you can have multiple roles in that one account, which can be assumed by other entities. This gives you different levels of permissions. This is a really important topic, and we're going to get around to it in more detail later. But right now, all you have to know is that each role in an account can have different levels of permissions attached. So all this together forms blast radius. The furthest extent to which an attacker has reach is the extent of the blast radius in your environment. And you can subvert this, but please, please, please don't. I have personally found a Jenkins box that had no authentication, open to the world. All you do is you log into its IP address and ask nicely, and it spat out a dozen API keys and secrets. That meant that from this one compromise, I was able to have admin access over a dozen different AWS accounts, like CI/CD, continuous integration, continuous destruction. It's not a good use of the tooling. So never put more in an account than you're willing to have compromised at one time. If you're still having a little bit of trouble understanding it, look at these adorable eggs. They're big eyes looking up at you, filled with wonder. Aren't they adorable? But all these eggs, they're in one basket. And that one basket is one mistaken IAM policy grant away from disaster. Like here, which is what happens when you make slides while hungry. Or here, all these eggs in one spot and they have all been damaged. If you're still having a little bit of trouble getting the concept, putting all your eggs in one basket is bad. That's how things end. So that's why you should go multi-account. But everyone else, all that stuff I just talked about makes sense to people like us, security people, kinds of people on the stream, the kinds of people that when you do web searches on stock photo websites, you get stereotypes like this guy, white guy, beard, wearing sunglasses in a dark room, hacking away at a laptop. Like, that's the stereotype, right? People with light up faces, or again, sunglasses in a dark room, although this guy with a face mask. And you know that these stereotypes were done by someone who didn't really understand security, because they didn't bother to reflect the code. They just sort of shoved whatever they could find in this dude's sunglasses, including the cute name thing there, which I thought was great. But the stereotype is of these hackers, security people, right? I bet those people even have tattoos. But here's the thing. Non-security people don't care about security arguments. You are trying to reach out to the business, okay? I have made a lot of security arguments to non-security people, and every single time it resulted in a lot of things like, oh, that's very interesting, or huh, good idea, but no action. Non-security people don't care about your security arguments. You speak different languages. If you want to make the non-security portions of your business truly understand and take action, you need to speak their language. And that language is money. Because it's a lot more of a compelling argument than, please do a security for me, to say, hey, this is going to affect the business in dollars. There's a great talk by one of my colleagues, Ariana Willett, at B-Sides SF 2018, Moving Security from Cost Center to Revenue Generator. And it's all about the ways that you can speak the same language as the business. Because when you say something like, it's good for security, they all hear it's bad for everyone else. If you say something like, this will reduce or eliminate security blockers, they're going to hear, our devs are going to spend way less time waiting and more time developing. When you say something like, it's best practice to be multi-account, what they're going to hear is, oh, our architecture sucks. You know what? Here's a bunch of reasons why you're wrong. Your so-called best practices don't apply here. And what you're saying just doesn't work. And the part that's kind of hard, that last one there, they might actually be right. Like I encountered that, and I realized, sure, like there's best practice, but there's also realistic best practice. And yeah, the speed of light is going to make an appearance. Let's keep talking about good reasons that you can make arguments to the rest of the business. If you have an atomic financial group per account, you can determine how much that financial group is spending. So something like per team billing is ideal. Makes it really easy. If a team owns multiple AWS accounts, calculating spend is really simple addition. If you have just one developer who owns an entire account, right, that's their playground, then 100% of the spend is attributable to them. Shared accounts have a few more problems, like who's going to pay for what. And this is the kind of a thing where it's like, well, see, I know we both share that ELB, but like I have 80, you have 80% of the traffic and I've got 20% of the traffic. So like really, I shouldn't be paying half. We should be like calculating it. It's just, don't do it. Smaller accounts are easier to accommodate than larger accounts. It's way easier to figure out how much you're spending. Especially because if you have multiple accounts in a team, then it's very easy when that team grows bigger and bigger, and now you can't feed them with 2 pizzas, even the extra super giant sized ones, and you got to split that team apart. It's going to be like deciding who gets the cat in the divorce when you're trying to figure out which resources go into which account. It's a lot easier to start with very small accounts and aggregate them up than to try and into one team's cost center, internal bill, than it is to try and split apart all these components of one account into multiple bills. So, lesson number 4, because if you believe the marketing hype, the cloud is infinite. And I'll tell you it is, until it isn't. There are fundamentally 3 different kinds of limits in the cloud. Soft limits. These are ones you open a ticket, get an increase. This is really more to protect you from you, so that way you don't accidentally spend a bunch of money or you build something that's not going to be sustainable. This is just, hey, I want more of something, you got more. Hard limits. This is different. This is when the soft limits, the dial is at the top. and you have to open a product feature request to get an increase. This is where if you're like, hey, I want 1,000 S3 buckets in an account, and S3 team comes back to you and says, well, we can give you 300. You can now, this is a hard limit, but you can make an argument. Remember, speak the language of money. It's how businesses work. Say to the S3 team, hey, this would help us spend more money on S3, on Amazon in general, make the product better if we could have 1,000 buckets in an account. And if you make a compelling enough business case, then that product feature request can get accepted and S3 may support more buckets per account. But then there's also physical limits. And this is where no matter how many tickets you open, no matter how many times you ask, the physical limits of the universe get into play, because it doesn't matter how much networking magic there is, data uploading from Virginia to Sydney can't have the latency drop below the speed of light. So you can look out at the sky, you can see these clouds, it goes on and stretches forever until you hit a wall right there in the middle of the cloud. But hard limits in AWS are per account. So if you want those 1,000 S3 buckets, open 100 different AWS accounts, free to do that. Put 10 buckets in each one, there's your 1,000. You want more lambdas, security groups, IAM roles, you want more of something? Well, and there's a hard limit, then you can just keep opening up accounts and scaling horizontally. And that makes a really strong business argument. And you can say, hey, instead of the security argument of let's put less things in an account, make the business argument of, well, we'll have a few less things in each account, but we can have more things total. More things is better. Now you can start making that argument to the business. Note that there are still physical limitations. So, for example, KMS throughput, right? It doesn't matter because that's a hardware-backed service. It doesn't matter how many HSMs or magic fairies or whatever else makes that service operate. You can open up more and more and more and more AWS accounts horizontally, but at some point there's a physical limit to the backing of that service, and you're not going to be able to circumvent that by scaling horizontally. But you can get your hard limit closer to that physical limit with more accounts. Well, how do you know how many accounts to have? Now we're starting to get away from science and more into art, because there's some things that you shouldn't split up. For example, it is tempting to split up accounts as far and as wide as you can. And like the security person in me is all for that, right? Blast radius and cost accounting, making your finance team happy. You can scale further, right? We put one S3 bucket in each account and we're just going to have 1 million accounts. But look, it's not always worth it. Your architecture might even prevent it. There is a complexity factor as well. Right? If you're going to have, 1 million accounts, that's 1 million things to keep track of. That's maybe a little much for your organization. Especially because for us at Twilio, we're constantly fighting the speed of light. Our business is communications, and a lot of those communications are real time. So for example, New York to Paris at the speed of light takes about 20 milliseconds, but that's in a vacuum. When light travels through glass, it goes 30% slower, which is now a whopping 26 milliseconds. You get networking equipment, in fact, it's imperfectly straight transmission in a fiber optic line, all that stuff, and you're looking at a 30 to 40 millisecond one-way trip, which isn't bad by all means. But the Advanced Television Systems Committee, the boffins who make your television work, they've done research into this, and they say audio-video synchronization is undetectable if the audio is 100 milliseconds behind, up to 25 milliseconds advanced. So for an audio-only system, they say that less than 200 milliseconds latency is good. And we can play some games about this, right? Because right here, how I'm speaking to you, this is relatively asynchronous, right? The traffic can get pushed up and pushed out, and as long as the audio and video get delivered within about 100 milliseconds, you're good. With our round trip New York City to Paris communication latency of maybe 80 milliseconds, again, that fits in the undetectable range, but we're still trying to have a conversation in real time. And having that 80 milliseconds of latency there can start to result in degradation of the communication. A lot of Twilio is really synchronous, so we have to worry about these things. If you have more asynchronous systems, then you maybe don't have to worry quite so much about things like the speed of light. But adding more accounts and interjecting more networking equipment between you and what you're trying to get done, adding more stuff in the flow may not be possible. The business just may not support it. There are some things that I know at Twilio are never going to be able to be multi-account, because even though Amazon's networking gets better and better all the time, it's still not going to be close to zero. And that's what our goal is. Okay, so now that I've just kind of rained on that parade, how do we talk about connecting all these things together? Well, assuming that your latency budget is either more forgiving than ours or less dictated by the speed of light between cities, and even if it isn't, you still have to worry about connecting all these different services up in all these different accounts. Fortunately, Amazon has a menu of options to choose from. In fact, you can start out by just allowing inbound from the world to your security groups. And I'm assuming, I can't actually hear you, but I'm assuming there's some people laughing along at home. But quite seriously, think about it. If you have public files and a CloudFront distribution being hosted out of an S3 bucket, and it's all public stuff, right? You want that stuff to be out there. Put it in its own account. Have that account allow public ingress. Your other accounts don't allow a open to the world security group at all. Just separate them. If you've got other kinds of traffic, then fortunately Amazon has got you covered. Not all of these services existed when we were building Twilio way back when in the days of EC2 Classic, but I mean, they've certainly made up for it with vigor. You've got all kinds of different options, but they all have trade-offs. Some of them are going to work for you. Some of them are going to have limits that aren't going to work for you. It's just, you're going to have to figure this out. Because some things like, S3 bucket policies, for some weird reason, they only work on S3, but they work great for S3. If you're dealing with transit gateway or private link, there's hard limits, but they're different hard limits, and you're going to have to deal with that. Something like Envoy, which is not operated by AWS, is going to be a little more complicated to manage and run, but at the same time, it's going to be interoperable between all your data centers and your cloud environments and your GCP and your Azure. And that's going to be very, very interoperable. You've got VPNs, which no matter what you do, are just going to suck to connect things up. And honestly, there's more all the time. This was stuff lifted from the Amazon networking products page. And you can read through all of them. Some of them weren't from that page, but there's a lot there. There's pros and cons to all of these options, especially depending on how much history you have, right? Twilio, again, it's a 10-year-old company. There's a lot of networking decisions that were made before some of the stuff existed. Sometimes there's an easy migration path, and sometimes there isn't. Here's pictured this is the internet. A friend's apartment had a poorly secured networking closet, and it was just left open. And it was so tempting to go poking around in there. It's like, a kid with a cookie jar right at the edge of the table. And it was so hard not to go looking. I'm personally like, if you were like, hey, Brandon, what is your opinion? Generally speaking, I'm partial to private link for your network-based traffic and using assume role calls to connect to other AWS resources in other accounts. So these are like two baseline things, but it gives you a good separation between network and AWS services. But this is going to depend on you, because if the hard limits for private link are a non-starter that don't allow enough headroom, then you're not going to be able to use that. If you're new to AWS, you can use pretty much anything. If you've got more history in AWS, it's going to take a little bit more testing to figure out. Let's talk about humans. So assume role calls, like I've been mentioning, are a great place to start building from. You can allow automation to gain API level access to other AWS accounts. It works smoothly. It's got great uptime. It works so, so nicely. And as we all know, humans are just a poorly written collection of microservices with a lot of bugs, extremely high latency, and overall poor taste in music. So you're going to have to still find a way to let humans access these accounts. And I know you may want to script everything, but there's some things that are hard to script, like your infrastructure as a code debugging. That's going to be really hard to troubleshoot with infrastructure as code. Responding to things like incident response, because you may have scripted out a million different IR policies and be able to run those scripts, but the incident that comes to bite you is probably going to be million and one. Right? You're always going to need to have a human in there, and you will have to solve this problem. You can say for the longest time, humans suck, don't touch my beautiful cloud account with your weird meat-based hands, but you know what? Humans are going to find a reason they need to get access to this account, okay? So don't try and stop them. It's a business need. Meet them halfway. There are options, and best is going to depend on your identity provider, how cloud agnostic you need to be, how granular you want to be. There's a whole variety ranging from the roll your own super complicated web of IAM users and assume roll calls. Amazon has a single sign-on service that even integrates with other cloud directories. You can use SAML-based stuff out there. There's all kinds of options. But what I really want to talk about here is Thors Hammer, Mjolnir. Because whatever solution you pick to allow access for these humans into different accounts, make sure that they can assume multiple roles in a single account. Because even if I am allowed to have admin access to an account, if all I'm doing is I'm logging in to look up an instance ID or make sure I didn't misspell that S3 bucket again, I don't need the ability to completely wipe the entire account, right? Just because I'm allowed to carry around Thors Hammer and log into an AWS account with it doesn't mean I need to log in with that hammer so that way I can go and just look and see what's there. You should at least have a read-only role in these accounts. This is basically the same concept that we've been working with for decades now with sudo on your laptop. There are some things where you are allowed to become the super user, but you just got to say, hey, I want those levels of permissions now. I don't usually need them, but now I want them. That's the same kind of implementation that you should be able to build with having multiple roles selectable from a single account. It's a little side eye at GCP because if you have org-wide permissions, you can drop into any of the organization's project and just completely ruin someone's day. Amazon gives you a huge amount of control over how you drop into those accounts, but it comes with a lot of complexity. And I don't want to say that one is bad and the other is good because that's too simplistic. It just, one of these cloud providers has chosen a much more simple way of operating, and the other one has chosen a much more complicated way of operating, and there are trade-offs involved with that. Since we're talking about organizations anyway, let's talk about organizations. First off, AWS organizations is way, way better than the bad old days before organizations, but it has drawbacks. You got to try to just avoid moving accounts between org roots if at all possible, because it is miserable. It's going to involve using the root user. It's going to involve credit cards. It's going to involve all kinds of forms. It's not fun to do. But organizations also gives you the ability to push security controls from the top down. Stuff like CloudTrail and guard duty, service control policies, all of these things can be controlled from the top down. But be careful because you can only push SCPs out from your organization root. So be careful who you let change those SCPs. You also want to make sure that you don't keep things like your CloudTrail logs and your guard duty logs in the root account. And I apologize, we're going to say root a lot in the next couple of slides. AWS generally uses root member or master member interchangeably to describe the relationships of these accounts. I'm generally going to use the terminology root unless quoting from the documentation, like right here, where Amazon tells you if you are setting up guard duty in a new organization, that the organization master can be the delegated admin, but then they go on to say this is not recommended based on best practices and the principle of least privilege, right? They call it out in a note here. It says, hey, you can give your root org account control over guard duty, but you should delegate administration. Let's go ahead and look at AWS Firewall Manager. So the AWS Firewall Manager says that you are associated with the master account of your AWS org or associated with a member account, up to you. It has to be this, but it could be the other one too. And also, if you go on to read, it says that if you enter an account ID that's not the org master account, it'll go ahead and set the permissions up for you. Okay, this is no mention of separation of policy or privilege. Like, this is just completely ignoring what another team has written in their dev guide. I'm going to go out so far to say, don't use the root org account is the new don't use your root account. Sorry that all the roots are confusing. By the way, don't use your root account either. Don't use your root account's root account either. And if this describes you, just stop right now. This presentation is being recorded. You can come back. You can fix it. Just don't use the root account. Root accounts are like, treat your root accounts like root vegetables. Just roast them. And again, I did this while hungry. Let's talk about a few more lessons, because you're going to get some email, a lot of email. Remember, org member accounts can have their passwords reset via email only. So if you have a mailing list set up for those root accounts, you're going to get a lot of email. This is a tiny snapshot of the emails that I get from AWS for a tiny fraction of our AWS accounts, because I am on that mailing list. So just be prepared for a lot of email and set up some email filters. So what goes where? Well, Route 53, notoriously bad IAM segmentation, put it in a different account. KMS, your encryption keys, works really well across accounts, put that in a different account. Backups, there's not backups unless they're in a different account and it's a one-way write to those backup locations. But what do you do about existing accounts, right? Like, this is great when you can burn it all down and start fresh. And there are some days I can get coworkers to agree with me. But generally speaking, you got to deal with some of your history. Build a new organization root account and move everything under that. Don't repurpose existing accounts that have stuff in them to use as your org root, right? See slide 9. Don't use the root org account as the new don't use your root account. You want to have as little as possible in the organization root as possible. And if you come across services that don't support out-of-account resources nicely, then file a feature request. We have accounts that have just KMS or just S3 buckets in them. And it's really annoying in a different account when you're trying to set something up. And it says, which KMS key do you want to use? Here's all the ones in your account. Naturally, there's nothing there. And there's also no way to pass in an ARN to say, use that key over there. Here's an example. Because some services are better than others at accepting keys. So we've got an EC2, KMS, and S3 account. Your custom code can handle these assumable calls very easily. Using my favorite service, the Super Taco service, you can get time-limited credentials from your compute resources over to your KMS and S3 buckets. When it's time to go ahead and upload an object into that S3 bucket, you have the object, you have the rights to use an encryption key, and you can push that all up into the S3 bucket. Later on, when it's time to go ahead and retrieve those permissions again, then you'll need to use STS, because if you don't, it's just going to say, hey, no permissions. To get those set of time-limited credentials, retrieve them back, and go ahead and access it. Now, why would you do something like this? Well, it's because it's just a lot easier to manage than having all these accounts gives you really nice control over what happens in those accounts. That first compute account can be a public-facing one. People upload documents. The second compute account here, that one can be private only. There's no way that the public can access it. No uploads at all. The first account can have put and encrypt only. The second account can have get and decrypt only. And this makes things really easy to baseline and monitor. Because if you have a KMS only account, then there's an alarm every time that there's a call in that account to create a new user, launch new instances, whatever. S3 only, again, same thing. If there's anything that steps out of line, super, super high signal to noise ratio, hit the alarm. So let's go ahead and wrap it up. Make good business arguments for why you should have multiple accounts. Sprinkle your resources across accounts like Santa Claus, like Santa Claus doles out presents. There we go. Let your users in, but don't always let them in with all their permissions. It's going to take some testing to figure out what you need. Make sure that your users aren't logging in with Thors Hammer. Connect resources together is going to take some testing, and make sure you have headroom before those hard limits. Smaller accounts with a singular purpose are a lot easier to baseline. have less things in an account so you can have more things total, much more convincing argument to the business, speak the language of money to them, and that way you know it's there. So, thank you very much. Please bring on the questions, leave feedback, bit.ly/CS FWDCS1 /CloudSec1. We have a bug bounty program. We do pay out in real money. So if you've been hacking away at Twilio while I've been talking, or you find something later on, please submit. We're hiring. If working with me sounds great, or if you want to find some other team far, far away, go ahead, look there. And also for my business card, you can text /CloudSec to 213-277-4252. Finally, please leave feedback, right? It is the gift that I can't return for store credit. I want it. Please pass it along.
Brandon, I think the most interesting discussion on the Slack was between Ryan Elkins, D-Hawk, and Joel about how to track the walls and blast radius when you have a multi-account environment, but there can't be really hard walls between them. And so I figured I'd ask two questions out of that. So first of all, I think you talked about assume roles and private link as technologies you can use. But what sort of tracking and standards would you recommend to maintain the balance of what's in what account?
So let me make sure I'm understanding the real the question, which is we have stuff that's going to have to be communicating across accounts. How do you make sure that it's all going to be kept secure, or how it's going to be
keep track of the blast radius of an
account? How do you keep track?
When the walls aren't
Got it.
clean, how do you keep track of the blast radius of an account?
Okay. So there's a couple of different ways that you can use. If you have especially older, longer-lived AWS accounts that are going to have a lot of stuff in them, it can be really, really tricky. The easier way is you limit the length of your AWS accounts. You have a certain amount of expiry time on it, and all you do is you say, well, we're going to burn down all non-essential accounts every, pick a number, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and that'll help enforce a little bit of hygiene across the environment. When it's harder to do something quite that drastic, and you're dealing with a long-lived account that has a lot of connections, is really trusted, it is really, really hard. You can inspect things like CloudTrail to see where assume roles of calls are coming in from. But the other thing that's really good at finding these sorts of over-permissioning issues is a red team, because they're going to want to demonstrate that they can get to a complete compromise. And so turning them loose on a really, perhaps let's say, porous account, and having them round up a bunch of credentials can be finding places where credentials may be existing is a good way to help try and get those walls to be a little bit more firm.
Cool. Let me ask one more question, which is Zach Reed asks, what pitfalls should we look for when we're moving accounts between organizations? How do we make that easier, and what can we expect to break?
So what makes it hard is that you have to turn an account from an organization account into a standalone account, which involves a lot of the things that organizations would have filled in for you. So you have to give it payment information, you have to give it security contacts, you have to give it a lot of new account setup stuff that only the root user can do, and also that you didn't really intend on ever having to do for these accounts. And then all of that work that you're going to put into it will immediately evaporate once it accepts the invitation to join the other organization root. Things that will break, you have to sever a lot of the links anyway before you can bring an account out of an organization. So I hesitate to give you a complete list of things which might break, because it is there's a long list, and I don't know all of them off the top of my head, but definitely if you have a production and a not production account, try it with the not production stuff first, because you'll learn what it means in your organization to break that link from the current organization root and moving it to a different org root.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. Great talk to kick off the day. We'll be back in 5 minutes with Kinnaird McQuaid talking about Policy Sentry. Thanks a lot, Brandon.
Thank you.